it could have an impact. It's very difficult to say, Beverly, because the increase, what they essentially done, they brought forward the increase they were planning for September into August. The problem's been so far with OPEC that now most of the OPEC countries can't even meet the quotas that they already have. So Russia, for example, is below 1 million barrels of their quota. The only ones that can reach their quota quite easily are Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, but they're not increasing. They're quite happy with higher prices. So really, the jury's out. If the Saudis and the Emiratis decide to increase their output, then it would certainly be very good for the market to calm the market and these high prices and tight demand as well. But if they continue as they have been doing so far, it would pretty much be meaningless.
And so why have some of those other Arab nations not been able to meet their quotas?
Well, it's barely, they just haven't invested enough money. It's the oil market is a little like the sort of Alice in Wonderland's Red Queen. You need to invest a lot of money just to keep running. And with low oil prices in 2014, 2015, I think there was less investment. The United States is another good example. So the investment is needed, and then it's usually a time lag of 2, 3, 4 years before we actually see that output come. And it's coming, but it's coming very slowly.
It is interesting, though, because, as you say, there's that disinvestment, but then there's also this challenge for many nations to seek energy resources and sources elsewhere. So it's hard to know just how much the industry needs to invest.
Well, it's a very, very good question, and you hit the nail on the head there. The problem has been outside OPEC countries. The problem is there's been a lot of government pressure to go to sort of net zero targets, and then the companies sit there and they say, well, you know, if I'm investing in oil, I have to invest money for the next 20 years, and in 20 years there won't be any demand, so I don't really want to invest money. And then some smaller companies also had problems getting the finance because there's been a lot of pressure on banks not to finance, quote, dirty investments. So we are in that sort of difficult situation right now where we still have the demand. The governments have done very little to curb demand. But on the other side, on the supply side, we actually have less supply. So, you know, one of the results of that energy transition is high prices.
Yeah, it's the perfect storm. And of course, we saw just last week the EU-wide partial embargo on Russian oil. So are they able to really source alternative resources, and what flow-on effect is that going to have?
Well, as far as Europe is concerned, you know, the oil markets are pretty perfect and they work very well. So all that will happen is we'll see higher prices because the Russians will have to go elsewhere, or namely to Asia, and they'll have to look for other customers like India and China. Europe will probably get oil from the Middle East and West Africa and so on. So the flows, the tankers will meet up in Suez Canal going their own way around. But what will happen is that prices will be higher. The barrels will be sourced, and there'll be a lot more pressure on Russia as a result. I think they'll find it harder and harder to sell their barrels.
So they'll be sitting on oil that has no customer and nowhere to go while the rest of the world struggles.
Well, that's the idea. It's not exactly working at the moment that way yet, because India has been buying a lot of barrels, so probably up to 1 million barrels a day of Russian crude. But it is getting harder outside sort of the shores of Malaysia. There are probably 60 million barrels of Russian crude looking for transshipments, and it's becoming extremely expensive and difficult for Russia to move that oil. And we haven't even started what we call secondary sanctions. We've only seen the first wave of sanctions against Russian oil. Europe definitely had to make this decision because it's very hard to tell India, please don't buy Russian oil. If India turns around and says, well, Europe is buying, you know, why wouldn't we buy it? But now that Europe is down to virtually nothing, it'll be much harder to impose secondary sanctions, which is what I expect to be happening in the next 12 months.
Is there anything else that can be done to try and ease this crisis?
To ease the crisis, I think what would probably the best thing for the governments, especially in Europe, would be not to subsidize energy, because you need energy demand destruction. By subsidizing demand, we're actually just creating even more demand later on and higher prices later. The right policies for the governments would be to let the prices do their work, but then help those who cannot afford with cash payments and help that way. And that would probably be the best policies. But right now, I think we are repeating some of the mistakes we made in 1970s, if you remember, when we had shortages and so on. Subsidies are not a good policy, that's for sure.
Yeah, which is sort of a little bit of what the government did here in a temporary way. Is this going to accelerate, do you feel, the push towards alternative energies? And is there going to be, are we going to be able to pick up that slack quickly enough?
I think it will be, Beverly, because already here in Europe, in the UK, I think roughly half the brand new cars bought are actually electric vehicles. If I was buying a new car, I'd be very reluctant to buy a diesel car. In the short run, it's a little bit frustrating because we see a lot of governments, including some European governments like Germany, moving back to coal. Even UK is thinking of just preserving some coals as a security of supply, sort of for power. But I think that's very, very short term. I think it's very obvious to most of us that we really have to move on and actually not be dependent on all the gentlemen out there that produce the oil, and they're not necessarily the best suppliers and the best for our energy security.
Yeah. And Australia too is looking at severe gas shortages. We've got plentiful gas, but we've sort of made these commitments to customers globally. Is that something that also is flowing on in the international market?
Well, it is. I mean, I think the other problem with Australia is not just commitments. I think the problem is that it's a vast country geographically. So connecting it with pipelines is extremely difficult and expensive. And then you actually need LNG terminals rather than just pipelines. I think Australia is just so lucky. We're a lucky country with so many renewable resources, sun, wind. I see no reasons why Australia shouldn't be putting more money into these renewable resources and actually just reducing their dependence and then selling expensive gas to other people.
Ari, let's hope some of that starts moving fairly quickly. Good to talk as always. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks.